Hi, my name is Chris Guida. I have worked on various things. I had a grant to work on dev education and merchant adoption. I'm also trying to form a circular economy in my town, so really trying to get merchants to accept Bitcoin, especially using their own nodes. And I'm also an aspiring Knots dev, so I've been reviewing some stuff on Knots. And actually, one of the things I've reviewed is BIP 110. So, yeah. So.
And I'm Josh Doman. I've also worked on various stuff, did some descriptor-related work, and I made a contribution to Bitcoin Core a few months ago in the Bitcoin kernel. And then most recently, I've been doing some work on transaction expiry, input-triggered transaction expiry proposal. So we're here.
Very interesting proposal, by the way.
Thank you.
Everyone, check it out.
Thank you very much. So we're here talking a little bit about BIP 110 and UASF and soft forks in general. I am fairly ignorant on this subject. So why don't you kind of give us a start overview? What's going on?
Yeah, so I guess what prompted this is I'm kind of amazed that there are people who came into Bitcoin after 2017. And we haven't been doing our responsibility as Bitcoin, as old Bitcoin devs teaching the new Bitcoin devs about UASF, because I think UASF is one of the fundamental foundational things in Bitcoin that gives Bitcoin value. Like when Bitcoin went to the moon in 2017, when the UASF activated, there was a reason for that. It was, actually the plebs are in charge. Actually the node runners are in charge, and the miners just work for the node runners. That's when we kind of realized that, and yeah, it's interesting. People seem to be forgetting it already, and it hasn't even been 10 years yet. So, but anyway, so
what came before UASF? How were things done before that?
So that was even a little before my time. But the way that I understand it was, in the beginning there was Satoshi, right? And Satoshi just kind of forked stuff however he wanted. He was just like, all right, this is the new version. There were hard forks, there were soft forks. So maybe we should talk about the difference between a hard fork and a soft fork. So this is pretty simple. So a soft fork is backwards compatible because it restricts the rule set. Mm-hmm. So anybody running an old node is going to automatically accept a soft fork because it follows all the rules. So this would be like taking the 1 megabyte block size that Satoshi put into consensus, and then a bunch of nodes decide that 500 kilobytes should be the new limit. So those nodes shrink the rule set, and then everybody else just follows the new chain because if you're fine with 1 megabyte, you'll also be fine with 500 kilobytes. So basically, that's soft fork. Hard fork is the opposite. Hard fork is where you're backwards incompatible. So these are much more difficult because this is changing a rule that the old nodes will not accept. So you're going to start. This would be like expanding the block size to a 2 megabyte block. So now you have a bunch of old nodes that are doing commerce on the old chain, and you have a new chain. So the old nodes will accept a change that tightens the rules. This is another analogy that people give is kosher food, right? If you go to the store and you look at all of the name brand orange juice and stuff, it's almost all kosher, even though 0.5% of the population actually requires kosher, right? So it's because the rest of the population doesn't care, right? Everybody's like, okay, well, if this rule set works for me, then this more restricted rule set is also going to work for me. So that's why restricting the rules is really, really easy. Loosening the rules is, of course, the other way, right? It's equally hard, right? So this would be as we said, so a soft fork would be tightening, the block size limit from 1 megabyte to 500 kilobytes. And a hard fork would be doubling the block size from 1 megabyte to 2 megabytes. So now all the old nodes that are doing commerce on the old chain are not going to even see the new chain because the new chain has 2 megabyte blocks, up to 2 megabyte blocks, and their rule says 1 megabyte. So they're just not going. They're going to reject all of those blocks and just not even see that chain. And so you're going to have a split basically.
So immediately prior to the first UASF, that's the correct term.
Yes.
There was signaling by miners, was there not, for prior?
Yeah, okay, so you asked about old forks, so how is this done? And this is why we talked about the difference between soft forks and hard forks. And I said, okay, so Satoshi, there were some times where he hard forked Bitcoin and some times where he soft forked Bitcoin. After Satoshi left, there was a period where flag day forks were done, and I believe these were all soft forks. Mm-hmm. I don't think any of them were hard forks. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was one technically kind of a hard fork that happened in 2013. But we can get into that later. But so Flag Day is where you just say, it actually is basically UASF. It's basically like, okay, Bitcoin Core has released this version of Bitcoin Core, and we're going to wait until we're going to set some date, 3 months out or 6 months out or something like that. And at that point, the new rules will activate. And at that point, the new nodes will start to reject blocks that don't follow the new rules.
Okay.
And so the miners are effectively forced to follow that, because if they don't, then there becomes a split. Right?
Okay. So it wasn't necessarily signaled by miners that they wanted adoption, but rather it was just a version of the software that people just ran.
It was more of a like dev activated software, right?
A dev activated software.
Yeah, it was kind of like, okay, the devs have decided that these are the new rules,
okay,
and everybody just needs to follow them. Right? So of course the devs don't. What?
One interjection. When you say everybody needs to follow them, do you mean that the devs and the node runners, they decide on the code that they want to do, and then the miners like fall into place, and they like, yeah, I agree to this.
Well, so this is the conversation, right? Everybody's arguing over who has more power and who has what power. But yeah, basically the devs create an activation client, right? They write a version of Bitcoin Core or Bitcoin Knots that contains the new rules and the activation logic for the new rules, and a number of people are going to decide to run that. Maybe 0 or maybe 0% of the network, or maybe 100% of the network, or maybe somewhere in between. And then there's the miners, and the miners have to either somehow ignore the fork, right? Like you could see a situation in which a very, very small amount, somebody randomly just decides, I'm gonna make the blocks 100 bytes or something ridiculous to destroy Bitcoin, and the miners are just going to ignore that because there's no significant portion of the Bitcoin economy that's actually running that version of the rules. But if as the number of people running those rules grows, the miners have to pay more and more attention to that. And again, with the kosher thing, like by default, the miners should follow the more restrictive rule set, because everybody accepts that rule set. And if they don't accept that rule set, there's a risk of a split. And miners need there to not be a split, right? Miners need to be able to sell their coins so that they can pay for their electricity and continue operating. And so going back to what you were asking, so we had these Flag Day things,
okay,
where the devs would just put the activation date in the client, and everybody would update predictably, right? Things weren't very contentious, back in the old days. It was just people just kind of fixing obvious issues. And the first contentious change was basically SegWit. So when you said, like, when did miner signaling start? This is, I guess, I'm sort of looking into devs' minds, but I'm guessing they were like, okay, well, we don't want to have to be in charge of the consensus rules. That's an obvious centralization vector. If the devs are just like, okay, you have to run these new rules. This is how other chains operate. This is, how Ethereum operates and all that. But in Bitcoin, they were like, okay, well, we want to decentralize things, and we want to have hash power signaling, which in in an environment where Bitcoin is, one CPU, one vote, right? Where there's CPU mining, hash power signaling might be a good way to do things, but in an environment where hash power is very centralized and there's only a few entities building all the blocks, that becomes a problem. Because you only have a few entities running blocks. You have tens of thousands of nodes that are accepting the blocks. So devs were like, okay, well, we don't want to be the ones to make the decision. How do we decentralize this? And so they were like, we're going to do miner signaling. And so BIP9 was how this was implemented in Bitcoin Core. And then there were a couple of forks, I think it was CSV and CLTV, that were activated using BIP9. There might have been some other ones that I don't remember, but I think those were the first two. And so the cool thing about BIP9 is that you can actually have multiple signaling. You can have soft forks for multiple different soft forks in flight. So you can just be like, you can have a bunch of different proposals, and the miners are signaling, oh, I want soft fork A, but not soft fork B, et cetera. In practice, we've never ended up doing that. There's always one soft fork that everybody, that everybody's paying attention to. And so, yeah, so like I said, the first couple of BIP9 proposals were just activated by miners because the miners were like, we don't have any problem with this. SegWit came along, 2016, November 2016, that's when signaling for SegWit started. And the way that BIP9 works is there's a timeout. So for SegWit, the timeout was 1 year. And after a year, if the threshold was not met, so the threshold is 95%, the threshold is not met, then the software gets canceled, right? So basically what happened was we gave the miners a veto over the change. So the devs like put all this work into writing this amazing new feature.
The miners can say no.
And the miners said no. Yeah, okay. So,
Sorry. How did they say no? Did they say no because they did not choose to update their node software?
Yes, kind of. So the way that BIP9 works is there's a little bit that is in the block version, and that it's called version bits. And the way that that you signal for a particular soft fork is you turn on the bit that's associated with that soft fork. So with SegWit, what happened was the percentage of blocks signaling for SegWit started to go up, and then it started to go back down. And so what everybody realized after a few months is that there was a company called Bitmain, which actually was manufacturing all of the ASICs, I think. There may have been some competitors, but they were pretty much the only game in town, and they kind of still are. And they decided to hold SegWit hostage, right? They were like, we actually want a hard fork to activate SegWit. We don't want a soft fork. And eventually it came out that they were probably using this thing called covert ASIC boost, which was giving them an unfair advantage, basically. And doing it as a soft fork would, do something to the field that they were using to do covert ASIC boost. And so they were dominating the hash power industry because they had this sort of secret advantage. Actually, I'm not sure if it's actually been proven yet that they were doing this, but I think there's been a lot of evidence that they were. But it sort of became okay. There's some strange reason why they're requiring us to do this as a hard fork and not as a soft fork. So anyway, so they decided to hold it hostage for whatever reason. We think that's the reason. We don't know. And so some devs got together and released a thing called a UASF, which is a user-activated soft fork. So SegWit, the way that BIP9, sort of vanilla BIP9, is a miner-activated soft fork. So it basically says, okay, we're going to use this bit in the block header, and as soon as X percentage of all the blocks are signaling for this soft fork, all of the nodes that are running the activation software are going to activate the rules. We're going to consider the soft fork to be activated. So, any questions, by the way?
I follow so far.
Okay, cool. So, the signaling started in November. It was going to expire a year later, November 2017. By March, everybody realized, oh no, the miners are going to veto this. And the community was like, wait, we shouldn't let the miners just veto this perfectly reasonable feature.
Interesting.
So we're going to release a UASF, which was called BIP 148. There was a developer named Shaolin Fry who sort of came out and released a UASF client and was encouraging people to run it. And it's basically set a flag day on August 1st, which was a few months before the expiry. So it was going to expire November 2017. So August 1st, there was going to be an additional soft fork. The additional soft fork said, if you don't signal in favor of SegWit, your blocks will be rejected.
Oh, wow. So if you don't so not that SegWit will be enforced, but rather that you've signaled in favor of it.
Correct.
Interesting.
Right. So, and basically what that does is it forces the miners to signal for SegWit, which then...
If enough users are rejecting their blocks.
If enough users are rejecting their blocks. That's the question, right?
And miners really want to get their subsidy, right? Because that's where most of their money comes from.
Exactly.
And so
right.
If they think that they won't get their block propagated across the network, I suppose.
Right.
Is that the concern, or is the concern just that they're going to be mining the wrong chain?
Well, the concern is that if part of the Bitcoin economy is rejecting your blocks, then there will be two versions of the Bitcoin chain. There will be a split. Because presumably some of the miners will be mining on the stricter chain, and some of the miners will be mining on the looser chain. And the crazy thing about the UASF, actually, Mechanic has a great video on this where he explains the sort of game theory of the UASF. But because the stricter fork is accepted by all the nodes, but the looser fork is rejected by the nodes running the stricter software, there's what's called wipeout risk for the nodes running, for the miners who are mining blocks on the looser chain. And the wipeout risk is where the legacy chain can actually just disappear. And including all the miners that are mining on it will start to accept the stricter chain as the correct chain, if the stricter chain becomes longer than the legacy chain.
Sure, makes sense.
So even if you start out with practically no hash power on the stricter chain, if at any point the stricter chain becomes longer than the looser chain, all of the work that was done on the looser chain and all the money that was earned by the miners on that chain vanishes.
Hold on a minute. But my understanding is that it's not the longest chain, but it's the chain with the most work done.
That's what he meant.
Yes. The word longest and shortest are used as proxies to mean heaviest and lightest.
So
yes, I should be saying heaviest and lightest.
It's
heavier
not
and
about the number of the blocks.
Yes.
It's
about the amount of proof of work. Yes.
The amount of proof of work. And how is the amount of proof of work quantified?
By the difficulty of the solutions to the proof of work.
Okay.
I think it's. I actually don't know this, but I think it's by the difficulty of the blocks that are being solved. So you can. I don't think it's by the hash that is found.
No.
I think it's by the difficulty of the blocks.
I don't know either. I think it's presumably
I should confirm this.
Some cumulative sense of difficulty of the whole chain, or at some point.
Right.
And so just to clarify here, you're not suggesting that the existence of a stricter client or a stricter fork then guarantees this fork's success. You're saying that as long as the stricter fork gains enough belief that it will be the chain of most work, then it will become it's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, it's basically, it's a coordination problem, right? It's a prisoner's dilemma. Because basically what the miners are all thinking is, okay, is there any chance at all that this stricter chain will become longer than the longer chain? Is it a greater than 0% chance?
So
if so, why not just mine the stricter rules?
So presumably with SegWit, the miners concluded that there was a very high likelihood that they would lose if they tried to fight it.
Correct.
And so they jump shipped, and then as more of them jump ship, they all jump ship, and soon enough, it was a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Exactly.
And so going back to, I guess, BIP 110 we were talking about earlier, at first, it sounds like BIP 110 is going the UASF route. Is that correct?
Correct. Well, yes, I mean, effectively. So it has a miner activated portion and a user activated portion. The miner activated portion is referred to as early activation. And this is kind of like, okay, if the miners reach this particular threshold, they can activate the rules early.
And that already started.
It started a long time ago, and it's almost over.
Almost over. And what's coming up is a UASF?
Yes. There's a thing called mandatory signaling, which is coming up, which is effectively the same thing BIP 148 was doing in SegWit.
Got it.
So it's forcing signaling.
It's forcing signaling. It won't be actually enforcing any rules,
right?
But it will be enforcing signaling on the rules to be adopted.
Right. And then because there's a requirement that 100% block signal, then the fork is guaranteed to lock in. And then because it's guaranteed to lock in, it's guaranteed to activate.
Let's just push down on that point again. You said guaranteed to activate.
On the nodes that are running the activation software.
Okay, so
any miners that are mining.
If you're a node running the activation software, there is no future world in which activation fails, from your perspective.
Well, so it depends on what you mean by activation. So there is no way for the activation to fail if your node is running the UASF software. So it will activate on your node. And anybody else who's running that node, it will activate on their node. And any miners who are mining blocks with that node, it will activate on their node.
And what happens, so just to be clear here, let's say that I'm running a user-activated node. I'm going to start rejecting blocks that aren't signaling. So the idea is there's no cost to other block producers to throw in a bit flag. So why not do it so that your block gets accepted?
Right.
And you think that most likely that is what they will choose because there's no cost to them doing so.
Right.
And as a result, if you're running NOTs or running a UASF activated client, you will still be getting blocks. You'll still be able to use your money, et cetera, et cetera. In the event that miners aren't including the flag, then you're basically going to have a halted chain. Is that right?
For whom? You're saying if 100% of the miners decide not to flip the bit from 0 to 1, then
well,
the chain will halt.
presumably,
Or if 0%.
presumably, as soon as one miner chooses not to put the flag in, and the other miners continue to build on that chain, then you're not going to see anything, correct?
Who's you? Like who is? You're not going to see anything.
When I say me or when I say you, I'm referring to someone running the activation client.
Right.
And you're not going to accept any blocks that have the flag set.
Right.
Or have the flag unset.
Unset, yeah.
So
let's
suppose,
if nobody is building blocks that set the flag, yes, your chain.
Or let's say that people are building blocks that set the flag, but they're not willing to they're not willing to only mine on chains that set the flag. Let's say that you're Marathon and you get a block from Bitmain or whoever, F2 pool, and that an F2 pool hasn't set the flag. Are you saying that Marathon now needs to reject their block if they want it to be accepted by you? It sounds like the answer is yes. Is that right?
I mean, yes, because
yes.
because
so,
after the mandatory signaling period starts,
correct.
Any blocks that don't signal are rejected by the activation client.
So you're basically telling miners only mine on blocks that we accept.
Well, that's what the nodes are always saying.
Okay, just to be clear here.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Sorry, I'm the newbie here. I'm trying to figure out exactly what's going on. So you're running a client, and your client basically tells the whole network, if you aren't setting this flag, your blocks will never be seen by us, and likewise, we will never see your blocks.
Right.
And so my question...
I mean, we'll see them, but we'll consider them invalid and delete them.
You'll reject them.
Yeah.
So my question is, are you not concerned about seeing no blocks that you accept at all? Like you'll just have a chain that just is ground to a halt, and unless there's miners out there willing to spend a bunch of money mining a block that only you will acknowledge, that other miners might never mine on, so that it doesn't progress very far. Like I'm just confused here. Like what it seems like the stakes are pretty high for the miners if they get it wrong.
Yes, and that's another asymmetry, right? The miners have much more to lose than the node runners who are running this. Although the node runners have a lot to lose too. From the point of view of the node runners who are running this software, this is a very important matter for the future of Bitcoin. This isn't just Bitcoin is not just a profession for us, right? It's a way of life. We're a part of something that's bigger than us, and so we want it to work. We think it's positive for the future of humanity.
So I guess to that point, I suppose.
But our businesses and our savings are also reliant on,
So
in terms of individual, incentives.
Would you recommend somebody who's running an active Lightning node or a Lightning node to be running your software?
Yeah.
You would feel comfortable with that?
Yeah, I mean, it is risky, right?
With time-sensitive money, rather than just saying long-term cold storage.
The thing is, there is risk in that, right? There is a risk that the miners would reject the software. But the thing is, if the network is demanding a stricter rule set in order to protect Bitcoin from attacks, and the miners reject that new rule set, the miners are attacking the network, and the miners are not in charge. The nodes are in charge. And the reason why the miners can't be in charge is because of the thing we said at the beginning, which is that the miners are like 5 companies. So do we really want 5 companies to decide the rules of Bitcoin?
Yeah.
Or we'd rather have a decentralized
Well, I
network
mean,
of tens of thousands or
I
hundreds of
think
thousands.
that's a very fair point. I think that what you're describing is a worthy test or reminder, perhaps, of how consensus actually works.
Right.
People, for me, what you're describing is long before my time.
Right.
And so a lot of people aren't even familiar with how consensus actually works, because it's not this mythical process come down by a few leaders who tell us what we're going to do.
Right.
There's actually a process, and there are users who actually have power and have some authority, and there's
Right.
leverage that different parties have, and so you're asserting a right that every user has. Whether or not it's going to work, we'll find out.
Right.
But you're asserting the right that exists.
Right. And we already know that it works, right? Because of BIP 148 and how that forced the activation of SegWit. And BIP 148 was actually less popular than BIP 110. So the number, by absolute and percentage-wise, BIP 148 was a lower number than the number of people running BIP 148.
I suppose the question is both number of people running in terms of node count, but also who runs, I presume. And not everyone's created equal. It's not a democracy.
Yeah, right. Yeah. There's a lot of gray areas, and what is consensus? But so the theory behind the UASF is if all of the network is going to accept the new rules and don't think that the new restrictions are harmful, and a small or large vocal minority thinks that it's existential, then the change should just happen. If nobody thinks the changes will be harmful,
I'm not sure. If nobody thinks it's harmful, okay.
Right. Or if nobody,
Do you think that's true with the BIP 110 case?
Yes. So the
Sounds like some people
the
think otherwise.
UASF nodes are in charge theory says that if you UASF, if somebody UASFs and tries to do an evil UASF, so this is what people say. They say, well, doesn't that mean
I'm
that
sorry, you repeat the word.
Evil UASF.
An evil USF.
Yes. So basically, people always say, well, doesn't that mean that people could soft fork to restrict the blocks down to 100 bytes or something like that? And it's like, well, yes, but the defense is a URSF. So there's a thing called a URSF where you do a user rejected soft fork, and you hard fork against the UASF in order to keep the rules the same, basically.
Has that ever happened?
No. But
Interesting.
if we start seeing lots of UASFs, we might start to see more of these sort of malicious UASFs, and then we're going to have to start getting creative with URSFs and things.
I guess the other question I suppose I have is, from my perspective, the goal of a UASF is not just to impose what you think should happen, but to learn what the consensus is. So that means that there should be a measurable positive outcome and a measurable negative outcome, meaning we can measure, yes, consensus says yes, and we can measure consensus says no. What does the latter look like in the UASF process that you're describing for BIP 110? Like how would you say, okay, we tried, we measured, and the measurement was no?
I mean, so there have been attempts to UASF Bitcoin, or attempts to activate soft forks. So the CTV episode is sort of the thing that people talk about, where somebody made an activation client for CTV, but it ended up not activating. But I mean, I didn't actually look that closely into why it failed, but it seemed like the community was very, very vocally hostile against it.
Hostile against it.
Yeah, and basically drove the leaders of the activation effort to effectively call off the effort. And once a movement is large enough, even that won't work. Like once enough people are running the fork client, and the deadline is coming up, it's just going to happen, right? People aren't going to just stop running it because maybe a few people who were leading it say, I changed my mind or something like that. So a UASF is a decentralized phenomenon. But it does seem like if you stop it right at the beginning, by just being vocally against it, like just a lot of people loudly vocally against it.
I mean, it sounds what you're suggesting is, okay, there is precedent. The precedent was the CTV activation client of however many years, 4 or 5 years ago, whatever it was. It failed. We can say provably, we know, looking back, it failed. And I still haven't gotten the right answer that I was looking for in terms of, okay, BIP 110, you do have a people backing it. What does failure look like? How does, even if you have 15,000 people, that's still not consensus. Bitcoin is bigger than 15,000 people. So how do you measure failure in this process? Or do you just keep going and say that there can't be failure? And that's also
you could, right? Yeah.
So
you could there are a number of different things that could happen, right? You could end up with a chain split, in which case it will almost certainly resolve in favor of the stricter rule set. You could end up with a halted UASF chain where nobody mines any blocks for, I don't know. I mean, you still have nodes that are if you still have 15% of the Bitcoin network that's running the code, and they're just not, nobody's building blocks that they accept, but they're still there. And if somebody were to start mining blocks that those nodes accept, then that chain has the potential to catch up. So it's hard to say when the movement fails as such, but it seems to be the movement itself is a consensus phenomenon, right? So whenever you see the movement give up, I guess is what you would say. Whenever you see,
Interesting.
Usually there's leading figures that just say, oh, well, we're not doing this or something like that. Or you could have a hard fork scenario.
So just kind of summarize for myself, it sounds like there is a quantifiable, measurable phenomenon, which is, are there miners who are risking their own capital to mine blocks on this chain, even if most miners aren't doing so? And then there's a less quantifiable phenomenon, which is like, when we look on spaces on Twitter or on the mailing list, etc., do we see the voices there that we used to see? And at some point, you could see one or two measure in the negative direction or the positive direction, but that's a measurable thing we can look at.
So there's objective stuff, which is does the heaviest chain have the new rules or not? Right. A certain distance past the deadline, right? There's always the chance that the stricter rule set could come back and win. Mm-hmm. But maybe after like a day or a week or something like that, you say, okay, well, this failed. Let's try something different. One
of the big FUDs. Did you watch the Wicked video? Do you know Wicked?
The Wicked. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
He's.
I watched this.
He loves the FUD.
Okay, yeah.
He loves it.
So the premise, Josh, did you see this video? Do you know what I'm describing? So what he said there's 3 scenarios of what will happen on BIP 110 activation day. And he was referencing a scenario that he says, okay, here's the BIP 110 chain, and then here's the core chain. The BIP 110 chain has lower hash rate. So it still will continue creating blocks, but at a much lower rate. So it's not coming to a total halt. But whenever, say, like the hash rate.
Well, but so you so you have to realize that that is a chain split.
Yeah.
And miners are bleeding money in that scenario. Absolutely bleeding money in that scenario. Miners have to resolve the split. Their survival depends on it. So they really can't just let it go on. They have to resolve it somehow. The longest chain split in Bitcoin's history was 36 blocks. If you go longer than 100 blocks, you start getting weirdness with the Coinbase transactions getting spent.
What was the 36 block one?
That was the one in 2013, where there were 2 different versions of the database, where one had a secret limit at around 500 kilobytes, and the new database, this is LevelDB, when they turned BerkeleyDB to LevelDB, LevelDB did not have the same limitations, so it was able to actually make 1 megabyte blocks, and greater than 500 kilobyte blocks were just being silently rejected, I guess, and people just hadn't been realizing. It was because it was this thing in the database. So anyway, version 0.7 was the stricter rules, and version 0.8 was the looser rules.
You don't see a scenario where there's 1 month passes and there's 2 parallel chains running, and one is running at a much higher, and then there's a dedicated.
No, you couldn't. It would be absolute chaos because because there's no replay protection, right? So you'd have you'd have two different coins, except both of them are Bitcoin, and so there would be no resolution as to which chain is actually the correct Bitcoin, and so like. And everybody sending money on one side would have their money sent on the other side too.
And you believe that the miners would pick the one that has the stricter rules?
Yeah, their incentives are crushingly massive to pick the stricter rule set.
Even though, because currently Ocean said we're supporting this.
Yeah.
So Ocean.
But they let their miners mine their own block.
That's true.
Yes. But they changed their default stratum endpoint to signal for BIP110, which is like 5% of their hash rate.
Okay, so let's say that's 1% of the total Bitcoin hash rate. When the activation day comes on August 8th, the other miners who have not yet signaled, they will switch over because they want to resolve it as soon as possible.
Right. Because they don't want there to be a chain split. And also, again, they're not in charge. If they ignore the decentralized node network, then they are usurping the throne, right? They're putting themselves in charge of Bitcoin. And then we have, 5 entities that can decide the rules of Bitcoin. And so it implies that if a soft fork cannot be enforced by a minority of the economy, then it just takes a certain number of nodes, accepting, I guess, a certain probably percentage of the economy is probably a good way of looking at it. A certain percentage of the economy to agree to run a looser rule set that favors huge nodes in data centers, and then the miners would be able to hard fork Bitcoin to whatever rule set they want, including increasing the 21 million cap, etc. So, if the decentralized pleb node network wants to tighten the rules, the miners have to follow that. Otherwise, it implies that the miners can unilaterally loosen the rules. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you're mentioning the raising of the 21 million limit. Do you think that the block subsidy FUD is real, like the security budget? I
don't know. I've gone back and forth on this a lot of times. And there are a bunch of people on my side, I guess you could say, that say it's not a problem. Because,
Kanza.
What?
Like Kanza.
Kanza.
Kanza says it's not real.
Anyway, we're beefing. I'm ignoring Kanza. Marcel is actually the one that I wanted to talk to. So Marcel was the one who actually sort of popularized this idea of renting hash rate. And basically the idea is, well, if Ocean lets you build your own block templates, and there's vendors out there that are willing to sell you hash rate, then it actually makes sense once the subsidy runs out to simply rent your own hash to make sure that your own transactions get secured in the blockchain. It makes sense for you to pay some percentage of your stack, every year in order to make sure that reorg risk is low.
Right.
So I don't know if I buy that. It seems plausible. But we've also, the other side of the argument that I see is that it does seem like when we had the halving in 2024, it seems like the miners kind of had a little revolt. They were like, you know what, Bitcoin nodes, we don't care about your stupid money. We're going to mine spam because we get a bunch of fees from this, and it's kind of like that. It's kind of like, we're not working for you as much because you're not paying us anymore. So, so you're giving us a pay decrease, basically, So we're going to go do some side gigs, Yeah, so we're gonna go find some other clients, and we're gonna go work for them instead. And we don't work for Bitcoin, the monetary network. Now we work for the spammers who are trying to.
When do you think that change started?
At the halving, at the 2024 halving. So it seemed like the miners kind of threw a hissy fit, basically, and there was all this runes stuff going on and all this spam stuff going on right around the halving. Of course, they timed it for the halving in order to have their epic SAT or whatever it was.
And this is the same miners that is like, if the miners pick the looser sets,
right,
the activation day will come, and then there's a set of miners. They have to make a decision: do they want the stricter rules or the looser rules? But it seems like they would favor the one that has the spam on it.
Well,
maybe if they're only considering that if they're ignoring the fact that they're not actually in charge, and they're only considering short-term profits. In the long term, I think it's all a wash. So in the long term, the difficulty adjustment makes it a wash. If all miners are required to, if there's a high amount of general spam, right, on the network, all miners share equally in that, and all of their hash rate rises because they all have additional funding, and then the difficulty goes up too. It's all a wash at the end of the day. And then the same is, if there's no spam, it's the same, right? Everybody's earnings go down in the short term, and then everybody's hash rate goes down in the short term, and then the difficulty comes down, and everybody's exactly where they were. So in the very, very short term, I can see why miners would like spam. But number one, the difficulty adjustment after 2 weeks, it kind of doesn't matter. And in the more long term, Bitcoin is a monetary network, and its value comes from facilitating payments. And so Bitcoin becomes less valuable if it's hard to do payments on Bitcoin. And so so presumably this is what Satoshi wrote. They're undermining their own investment by attacking the network instead of just doing what they should do.
Just want to make one comment. You made a comment, something along the lines of they will pick the one with the stricter rules, or that one will.
They have crushingly huge incentives to.
They have incentives to pick the one that has crushingly high odds of being the long-term winner. Correct? It's not the one that, it's not because it's stricter rules. It's because it's going to be the winner.
It's
right?
because it might be the winner, which means that it probably will be the winner, which means that it definitely will be the winner. Does that make sense? It's as you said, it's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because what happens is the miners are very short-term business, right? They're thinking constantly about short-term profits and surviving in the short term. It's very risky to be a mining pool. And so what they do is they say, remind me what your question was, sorry.
My question was simply, I was pushing back a little at the assertion that simply having stricter rules means that you will win.
Right. So what I'm saying is miners are trying to lower their short-term risk as low as they can.
Right.
And so wipeout risk is a massive risk. They want to avoid that. And so if there's any chance at all that their funds are going to be wiped out, they want to avoid that. Right? Mm-hmm. They're a risk-averse industry.
Mm-hmm. But what they would have to give up is that they would have to say, I'm giving up the wipeout risk, but I'm also giving up the ability to mine ordinals and inscriptions and so on. That's the same conscious decision that they're making.
Right. Well, but that's not a short-term concern anymore, because those things are just like, I don't know, $50 a block right now. So it doesn't really matter right now. And second of all, okay, if BIP 110 failed, there'd probably be a lot more spam on main chain, sure. But again, that would only do anything in the short term, right? In the long term, you have the difficulty adjustment, so it doesn't matter. And in the very long term, you have Bitcoins degrading as money. So it becomes worse money. It becomes harder to use Lightning, open and close Lightning channels. It gets harder to use ARC, settle on chain. Everything gets, all the actual monetary unilateral exit use cases or on-chain use cases are getting driven out. And so Bitcoin's value as a payment system goes lower, and thus as an asset it goes.
I got a question for you. This is maybe more speculative. Do you think that the continued existence of the subsidy harms the ability of users to advocate for the chain that they want? Meaning, if fees were the primary source of revenue for the miners, would the miners then have to be more responsive to the users?
Yes and no. No, because the people paying fees are not necessarily the users. Or they're not necessarily the users that you want to listen to.
Okay.
Consider that, maybe everybody in Bitcoin doesn't agree with this, but when I first came to Bitcoin, what I saw was a tool to end the fiat standard and get the Bitcoin standard in there as the reserve asset so that there isn't a money printer that's just the asset that everyone holds. It's the reserve asset that a few elites can print. And so when you consider that Bitcoin is a tool to upend that system, you have to consider that the money printer has an infinite amount of money to pay for transaction fees. Mm-hmm. And so even if it's not directly attacking Bitcoin, it might be printing a bunch of money and putting them into dumb use cases like shitcoins and NFTs. And you might see a lot of you might see those sort of pathological or harmful use cases drive out the actual useful use cases long before the valuable use cases start to get adopted and start to have an impact on people's freedom. So you could see that as a vector for the money printer to sort of indirectly kill Bitcoin without even looking like it's
interesting.
killing,
You're suggesting
killing
that Bitcoin's ability to succeed depends on the inability of use cases that you consider not desirable crowding out other use cases. Is that right? You use this word crowding out. There's a limited amount of block space, so we need to prevent use cases that are unaligned with our goals from existing and using that space because they would crowd out the use cases we care about.
Right.
Is that what you're suggesting?
Yes, I'm saying there are use cases that make Bitcoin more valuable, and there are use cases that make Bitcoin less valuable. And
There are use cases that make Bitcoin less valuable.
Yes.
I need to think about that some more.
Yeah. So again, so remember how I said that the mining industry, if we pay them less subsidy, they might go outside of Bitcoin and go to the fiat money printer and have that be their employer instead. And if the miners are being paid more by the fiat money printer than they are paid by Bitcoiners who want Bitcoin to succeed, then the likelihood is very high that the money printer will succeed in killing Bitcoin. The way that I see it going, if Bitcoin works and actually succeeds at what I consider to be its objective, which is to replace the money printer as the reserve asset, then what will happen is Bitcoiners have a specific culture that they are bringing to the world, which is, I consider it to be a pro-human culture. It's a culture that values creating value instead of destroying value. It values creating value instead of destroying value. It's funny how in the fiat system, the good behavior tends to be punished and bad behavior tends to be rewarded. Not all the time, but that's kind of the general gist of the fiat system. That's why we want Bitcoin, because Bitcoin flips the incentives, rewards good behavior and punishes bad behavior. And the way that I see this going, the revolution going, is that Bitcoin has sort of a strong core of I would say, like good human, pro-human values, right? And we just need to grow that core organically. And it will sort of naturally succeed as long as we stick to our guns, right? As long as we actually protect that culture and we encourage people who are joining Bitcoin to learn about those values and to take on those values themselves, and to see how fiat culture is evil.
So my concern is first that the people who are advocating for that culture will leave Bitcoin because they will be so discouraged if what I think could likely happen comes true is there is not sufficient consensus to see BIP 110 adopted for technical reasons and just plain reasons all other than we want spam on the network. If that were happening, it would be such a shame from my perspective for people, I don't know, like you or like other people who are advocating for this mentality to basically have given up. It could happen, as it could not. Like that's not an outcome that anyone wants.
Well, we're not giving up, but yeah, we would have to retreat. Again, like like we kind of hinted at this earlier, but if the miners collude to completely ignore the soft fork and basically just sell out to fiat money for fiat values, then yeah, the real Bitcoiners that I consider them would have to move to a different chain, and we would do that by firing the miners, by changing the proof of work.
But what about someone like me, for example? I personally wouldn't consider myself selling out by not adopting on a miner either. So where would I fall?
Well, you can always hold both assets.
I guess that's true.
Yeah, so the way that I see this going, actually, so in 2017, this is like, I don't expect this at all to happen. But if it does happen, I do expect the BIP 110 chain to win in the long term because the rules make it more valuable.
So you think there'll just be two chains?
Well, again, I expect BIP 110 to succeed. This proof of work chain thing is like last resort, like nuclear, it's like, okay, the miners are majority hostile, right? The miners have decided to attack Bitcoin, basically. So we are firing them by bricking their hardware and requiring them to use other hardware. Like that's what a proof of work change does.
Are you saying that the current ASICs that would be used to mine Bitcoin that the miners are using would no longer be effective?
They would no longer be effective on the
core chain.
on the chain that I would consider the real Bitcoin.
Okay. Do you use this term, the core chain? I've been seeing this on Twitter. There's the core chain.
I guess the core chain, yeah, whatever. I don't like that. I don't like that because it sort of because core is like 70 or 80% of the network, and that's actually not an accurate. Like, I think most of the people running nodes are actually just not paying that much attention. If you look at the people who are updating actively, Knots is actually more popular than core. If you look at the nodes that have been updated in the last like a year and a half or something like that, Knots is more popular. Yeah. And I'm just what is it? I'm not guessing, but I'm making an educated guess that most Bitcoiners who are running core actually agree with us. The sort of the core part of Bitcoin culture is now represented by Knots, but most of those people are just not paying much attention, right? But again, so here's how I see this happening, right? And this is why I think the soft fork is going to work. And I made a tweet about this. The soft fork is going to work because the hard fork would work. And the reason why the hard fork would work is because in 2017, there was actually a hard fork. So there were a bunch of people trying to make the blocks bigger. They wanted to hard fork to a larger block size. Actually, there were three groups. There was Core that wanted SegWit as a soft fork. There was SegWit 2x, which wanted SegWit and hard forks to twice as large blocks. And then there was a third group, which was the Bcachers. The Bcachers wanted to hard fork to a larger block size, and they did not want SegWit. So what ended up happening is they forked off at the same day that that BIP 148 was going to activate, which is August 1st, 2017. And to very little fanfare. There was almost nobody noticed it. But then when the SegWit 2x thing failed, when those guys threw in the towel on that, all of them flooded into Bcache. And what you saw Bcache was a very tiny minority chain. It was like, 0.1 Bitcoins or 0.01 Bitcoins. I don't know. It was a very small percentage of the, one Bcache was a very tiny percentage of one Bitcoin in terms of market price. And then after SegWit 2x failed, it went up to almost half. It was like 0.4 or something like that. And there was a moment where I was holding both, and I was like, well, which one is actually going to be the real Bitcoin? Which one is going to be which one should I sell,
Interesting.
And so, I don't think this is going to happen, again, because of what I'm talking about. But if it did happen, this would happen with BIP 110 too, right? Where the BIP 110ers would fire the miners with the proof of work change. And then the market would have to be like, which one should I sell?
And the market decides.
And the market would decide, yeah. And so the way that I read what happened with Bcache is they didn't have SegWit. And so they didn't have the quadratic hashing solution, and they were basically preventing themselves from ever building Lightning. They still haven't built Lightning. I keep telling them to build Lightning because I'm like, you might get some actual developers to come work on your stuff if you build it. But anyway, I was like, so basically Bitcoin is decentralized money, and Bcache is less decentralized and worse money, because Lightning does both. Lightning lets Bitcoin scale to a larger size while staying decentralized, and also while having a good UX for merchants, right? When you, I don't know if you've ever been to like a shop that takes Bitcoin, but back in the day we didn't have Lightning and you had to wait for a confirmation. Terrible UX.
Oh.
Yeah. So you're sitting there with your food, and sometimes they'll bring you the food, and then you'll eat it, and then you'll be like, especially when the blocks filled up, it was horrible because people the wallets didn't understand how to pay like a good fee, So you'd be sitting there and you're like, oh no, shit, this is going to take like a week. How do I, and you just like, it was a terrible UX for both the customer and the merchant. Yeah. So anyway, so people don't realize like Lightning, the Bcachers didn't realize like Lightning exists to solve that problem.
Give you a finality.
Give you immediate finality, exactly. This is why I like Arc. Arc also does the same thing. So, yes. So back to the crazy chaos that happened after SegWit 2x, everybody had to make the decision, which one should I dump and which one should I buy? Or should I just kind of wait and hold both of them, right? And the market ended up dumping Bcash, and Bitcoin was the one that ended up winning. And to me, it was obvious. It was like, okay, well, they decided to just shoot themselves in the foot by making their nodes harder to run, and making themselves worse money by committing to not ever building Lightning, right? So I was
But
like,
they have covenants.
yeah, sure. They're not doing anything with those. They're building a bunch of casinos. They're basically Ethereum 2.0. But anyway, so I was like, okay, so Bitcoin is going to be more decentralized and better money. So with BIP 110 makes Bitcoin more decentralized and better money, because what spam does is it discourages people from running nodes, and it causes actual payments to have to compete with these spam floods. And it makes Bitcoin worse money in other ways, and it causes centralization of the node network in other ways. There's actually really bad attacks that you can do with arbitrary data, which people don't like to talk about, but these vulnerabilities exist, and we should probably do something about them. Actually, this is a short-term attack that could happen on the legacy chain. There are some short-term attacks that could happen on the legacy chain that immediately take them out once BIP 110 activates. So we won't talk about those, but you might not want to be holding the legacy chain, is what I'm saying, after BIP 110 forks.
Well, thank you for explaining all this to me. I'm very interested to see what happens. I'm very much not invested in the conversation in either direction.
Yeah.
I'm skeptical, I'll say that, but I'll learn a lot, whatever happens. And if what happens is something that requires me to physically choose which software to run, then that will be a learning experience for me. So it'll be really interesting to see how this process plays out.